Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. My cousin and I used to explore the fields behind our grandparents' old farmhouse every summer. The place was vast, with acres of corn and wheat, a rickety barn that seemed like it might collapse any day, and a patch of woods that everyone in the family avoided. Grandpa always said it wasn't safe. Snakes, sinkholes, or some vague story about trespassers, we never believed him. This summer, curiosity got the better of us. On a lazy afternoon, after Grandma fell asleep on the porch, we grabbed flashlights and decided to explore the woods. It wasn't a planned adventure, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The air was cooler under the canopy of trees, the thick smell of moss and earth surrounding us. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the farm disappeared. No wind rustling, the corn, no birds. It felt like stepping into another world. My cousin, always braver than me, joked about finding hidden treasure or an old cabin full of relics. We didn't find treasure. What we found was something else. About half a mile into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure, a stone well covered with moss and half crumbling, like it had been there for centuries. But what was odd wasn't the well itself, it was the carvings on the stones around it. Strange symbols and spirals, etched deep into the surface, uneven like they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. My cousin leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. I expected to see water or maybe just darkness. Instead, there was a dull shimmer, like something metallic reflecting light far below. He whispered something, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on one of the symbols on the well's rim, a crude, jagged spiral. It felt alive, almost pulsing under the flashlight beam. Then we heard it, a voice. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but something low and guttural, echoing faintly from deep inside the well. My cousin stumbled back, dropping his flashlight into the pit. The light flickered as it tumbled down, illuminating the sides of the well as it fell. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow curling along the stone. I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but he just stood there, staring at the well, his mouth slightly open. When I shook him, he finally snapped out of it, muttering, "Did you hear it? It said my name." I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to get out of there. I pulled him away, and we hurried back through the woods, tripping over roots and branches. The air felt heavier now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, we were both gasping for breath. We didn't tell anyone about the well. Not that day, not that summer. But things changed after that. My cousin started sleepwalking, which he'd never done before. He'd wake up outside, standing at the edge of the cornfield, always facing the woods. One night, he woke me up, standing by my bed with a blank expression, saying he needed to go back. I tried to convince him it was just a dream, that the well wasn't real, or, if it was, that it didn't mean anything. But he was adamant. He said it was calling him, that it wasn't finished with us. The last straw came on the final night of the summer. We were packing up to leave the farm when I heard the screen door slam. My cousin was gone. I ran outside, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Grandma and Grandpa were asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods. I found him in the clearing, standing next to the well. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the darkness. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and shined my flashlight into the well. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. The shimmer from before was gone. Instead, there was something climbing up the walls, something with too many limbs, its skin slick and glistening like oil. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a mass of sharp, twisting shapes. I screamed, pulling my cousin away. As we stumbled back, the well went silent again, and the clearing felt empty, lifeless. He finally looked at me, his face pale, and said, "It knows us now." We never spoke about it after that night. The woods were off limits for the rest of the summer, and the next year the farm was sold. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us, and I hear its voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably calling my name. When I was a kid, my family lived on a small farm at the edge of a sprawling cornfield. It wasn't the idyllic countryside you'd see in paintings. Our house was old and creaky, and the cornfield seemed endless, especially at night. It was the kind of place where silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on you when the wind wasn't blowing. One summer evening, my parents went into town for supplies, leaving me and my older brother in charge of the place. The sun had just set, leaving streaks of orange and purple on the horizon. We were supposed to feed the animals and lock up the barn, but instead, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the cornfield. The rules were simple. Stay within the first 10 rows and don't go too far from the house. My brother, always the braver one, volunteered to hide first. He darted into the tall stalks of corn while I counted to 50. The corn rustled as he moved, the sound growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the field. When I finished counting, I called out for him, stepping into the rows with a mix of excitement and unease. The corn loomed high above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt louder than it should have, the dry leaves brushing against my arms and legs. "Come out," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer, just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the corn. I laughed nervously, convinced he was trying to scare me. I pushed forward, parting the stalks, my heart thumping a little harder with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound ahead of me, like footsteps, dragging through the dirt. I froze, listening. "Gotcha!" I yelled, sprinting toward the noise. But when I burst through the stalks, I stopped cold. It wasn't my brother. There was someone standing there, just a few rows ahead of me, their back turned. They were tall and unnaturally thin, with arms hanging too long by their sides. "Jason," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I realized I was lost. The rows of corn looked the same in every direction, and the farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I called out for my brother again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, it was faint and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. But it wasn't Jason's laugh. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh. The rustling started again, this time from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. My breathing grew shallow as I stumbled through the rows, the stalks closing in tighter. Then I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Its head tilted unnaturally as if it was trying to see me without turning all the way around. The laughter came again, louder now, and I bolted, pushing through the corn as fast as I could. The stalks scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I burst into the clearing near the house, panting and covered in dirt. Jason was standing by the barn, holding a flashlight, his face pale. "Where were you?" he yelled, his voice trembling. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he cut me off. "We need to go inside. Now." That's when I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his flashlight beam kept darting to the edge of the cornfield. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The figure was standing at the edge of the field, half hidden in the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could see its arms, long, spindly things that hung down past its knees. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. We ran inside, slamming the door and locking it. Jason pulled the curtains shut, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out. The figure was gone, but the cornfield seemed alive, swaying as if something was moving through it. We didn't sleep that night. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, we found footprints in the dirt outside the barn. They were huge, far too big to belong to any human, and leading from the footprints were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled back into the cornfield. We never played hide-and-seek again. It was late August when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the old lake house. No one had used it in years, but the idea of a weekend by the water sounded perfect. The house sat far from any main roads, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It felt like stepping into another world. The first day was peaceful, swimming in the lake, lounging by the dock, and grilling dinner as the sun set. It was everything we'd hoped for, a welcome break from the chaos of everyday life. But as night fell, something felt off. The house had a strange, musty smell, like it hadn't been properly aired out for years. We lit some candles and spread out, determined to make the most of the time we had. But the quiet grew oppressive. There wasn't a single sound other than the gentle lapping of the water. At around midnight, I decided to check the back porch. I felt restless, like something wasn't right. I stepped outside, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the trees. Then I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the water, perfectly still. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but there was nothing. No face, no movement, just a shadow blending with the darkness. I turned back, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told my friends about the figure the next morning, but they brushed it off as tired eyes or the shadows playing tricks on me. The second night, we stayed up late by the fire, sharing stories and laughing. But around 2 a.m., I woke up, once again feeling uneasy. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. I lay there staring at the ceiling until I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate coming from the porch. I held my breath, frozen in place. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear someone, or something, standing just outside the door. My heart pounded and I waited, counting the seconds that felt like hours. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the window and peeked outside. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, the sound of those footsteps lingering in my mind. The next morning, I decided to walk down to the lake, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. The others stayed behind, still groggy from the night before. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept turning, around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. The woods felt darker, quieter than before. When I reached the edge of the water, I decided to take a seat. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the water. It was peaceful again until I looked down. There, on the sandy shore, were footprints, but they weren't mine. They were bare, but far too large. They led into the water, vanishing beneath the surface. I backed away, my pulse racing. I didn't know how, but something had followed me. My legs trembled as I made my way back to the house, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. When I got there, my friends were still asleep. I didn't tell them what I saw. I couldn't explain it. But even now, every time I hear the rustling of leaves or the creak of wood, I wonder if something is still waiting for me by that lake. I work the night shift at an underground parking garage. It's not glamorous, but it's quiet and the pay is decent. The garage is massive, spanning 5 levels below ground. The air smells like oil and concrete, and the fluorescent lights buzz faintly, casting an unsettling pale glow. One night around 2 a.m., I was making my usual rounds. Most nights are uneventful. Empty cars, echoes of my footsteps, and the occasional shadow cast by a passing vehicle on the street above. But that night was different. As I descended to the fourth level, I noticed a car parked in a corner, far from any other vehicles. This wasn't unusual, some people prefer privacy, but what caught my attention was the driver's seat. Someone was sitting there, their face obscured by shadows. I called out, asking if everything was okay. No response, just the faint hum of the lights. I stepped closer, but when I was about 20 feet away, the figure turned its head toward me. It was too dark to make out any features, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Their head tilted slightly, like they were studying me. I decided not to press further. Maybe they were just waiting for someone. I finished my rounds quickly, but when I passed by the car again on my way back, it was empty. The hours dragged on. At 3:45, I was in the control room, watching the security monitors. I caught movement on the screen for the fourth level. The same corner where the car had been. A figure walked across the frame, slow and deliberate. The camera angle didn't give a clear view, but it was definitely the same person. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back down. When I reached the fourth level, the air felt colder than usual, and the faint smell of gasoline lingered. I shone my light around but saw no one, just rows of empty cars. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint metallic scraping sound. It echoed through the space, seeming to come from everywhere at once. My heart pounded as I swept the beam of my flashlight across the garage. Then I saw it, a handprint. It was smeared across the window of a car directly in front of me. The print wasn't normal. It was too large, and the fingers seemed wrong, elongated, as if they had been stretched unnaturally. I backed away, my flashlight shaking. Then the sound came again, closer this time. The scraping, like nails dragging across metal. I spun around, the beam catching movement just at the edge of the light. A figure emerged from between two cars. Its body was contorted, bent at impossible angles, as if its limbs had been broken and reassembled. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, stepping into the light with a grotesque smile stretched across its pale, featureless face. My legs froze. The thing cocked its head, mirroring the same curious tilt from earlier. It took a step toward me, its bare feet slapping against the concrete. I don't know how I found the strength, but I turned and ran. The elevator was too far, so I sprinted for the stairs. Behind me, the sound of slapping footsteps echoed. Faster, now, growing louder. I burst into the stairwell, slamming the door behind me. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it, the metallic scraping sound, but this time from above me. I looked up, and my flashlight caught the figure crawling down the wall, its body bending unnaturally, its fingers digging into the metal railings for support. I ran, stumbling over the steps, my breath ragged. When I finally reached the surface level, I threw open the exit door and collapsed onto the sidewalk. The cold night air felt like salvation. I quit the job the next day, but every now and then, when I park my car in a quiet garage or step into an empty stairwell, I hear it again, the faint sound of scraping metal, reminding me that some things don't stay underground. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum. Low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered. Fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. We lived in an old apartment building downtown. It was one of those places where everything creaked and the paint was peeling off the walls. The building had been around for decades, and rumors about its history had circulated among the tenants. Some said it had once been a hospital, others claimed it had been a prison. Whatever the truth, something about the place felt off. The first night we moved in, the floorboards groaned beneath our feet as we unpacked. My roommate, Alex, mentioned how quiet it was, too quiet. I had dismissed his worries, but as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It started subtly, whispers in the darkness, barely audible. At first, I thought it was my imagination, something triggered by the creaking of the old building. But the voices grew louder, persistent. They seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I would sit up, my heart pounding, straining to hear. There was no pattern, no recognizable words, just a low, menacing murmur that seemed to echo endlessly. One evening, as I was cooking in the tiny kitchen, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, just a flicker, darting between the fridge and the countertop. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I didn't know if I wanted to be relieved or terrified. Then came the night when it became impossible to ignore. The whispering wasn't confined to my room anymore. It followed me everywhere. The living room, the hallway, the bathroom. It was relentless, as though the building itself had become alive. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. The murmur grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't something I could escape. One day, while unpacking a box of old books, I found a dusty, tattered journal tucked away. Its pages were crumbling, but I could still make out some of the faded handwriting. It described something, a spirit, a presence that had been tormenting the building's residents for decades. The entries spoke of footsteps in the night, voices that couldn't be explained, and a feeling of being watched, always watched. That night, after reading the journal, the whispering changed. It wasn't just random murmurs anymore. It seemed to be directing its attention toward me. Words began forming in the static, faint at first, then louder. "You can't leave." I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, I called Alex, who had gone out earlier that evening. When he arrived, his face was pale. He had been hearing the same whispers, the same voices. "I can't take this anymore," he confessed. "It's like they're inside my head." That's when we knew we weren't alone. Whatever haunted that building had found us. We packed up the essentials and left. In the weeks since, I've tried to forget, to convince myself it was all in my head. But the whispers still come. In the quietest moments, when I'm alone, I hear them again, faint but unmistakable. "You can't leave," and sometimes I wonder if it's already too late. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. Could be an animal, Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. It's here, I gasped. It's still here. Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. Leave now, panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It started with a simple trip to a remote industrial zone, long abandoned and forgotten. My friends and I had heard rumors of a place no one dared enter, an old factory complex deep in the heart of an isolated stretch of land, untouched by time. The internet was full of stories, some claiming strange occurrences, whispers of ghosts that haunted the empty buildings. We wanted to explore it, curiosity outweighing caution. We arrived under the cover of night, the crumbling factory buildings, looming in the dim glow of our flashlights. The air was thick, laden with dust and the faint scent of decay. The towering chimneys rose like jagged fingers against the dark sky. We moved cautiously, each step crunching on broken concrete and debris. Inside the main building, we found a room filled with faded machinery, rusted pipes, and the faint echo of our footsteps. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. There were no windows, only the faint glow of our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The ceiling creaked above us, as though the building itself was unsettled by our presence. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind brushing through the empty halls. But they didn't sound natural. They came from within the walls, distorted, unintelligible. It wasn't the wind after all. They seemed to be carried through the very foundation of the building. We stopped moving, our eyes darting to each other, unsure if we'd heard right. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," Ryan said, his flashlight trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural murmur, as if they were coming from deep below, surfacing from the shadows of the earth itself. The air grew colder, and we felt as though we were being watched. Something was down there, beneath us. We couldn't see it, but we knew it wasn't human. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound echoed from the direction of a nearby hallway. We froze. The whispers intensified, mingling with the noise, growing louder, more insistent. A faint, flickering light appeared at the end of the corridor, casting unnatural shadows that danced across the broken walls. "Go?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't argue. We moved quickly, our footsteps hurried as we retraced our path. The whispers followed us, now echoing through the halls in unison, becoming a cacophony of distorted sounds. It was as if whatever had been lurking in the darkness was closing in. As we reached the entrance, something unexpected happened. The whispers abruptly ceased, replaced by a sudden, oppressive silence. We hesitated at the threshold, our hearts pounding. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was there, waiting. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Not just our flashlights, but the entire complex, as if the building itself was coming to life. The shadows became more distinct, growing longer, stretching toward us as, though drawn by some unseen force, a final, chilling whisper echoed in my ear, clear as day this time. "Leave." We didn't wait. We ran, out into the night, away from that cursed place. The factory loomed behind us, dark and silent once again. When we looked back, there was nothing. No signs of life, no evidence that we had ever been there. Now, months later, I can still hear those whispers at night. No one believes me when I tell them, but I know what I heard. I know we were not alone, and whatever was down there, whatever remains, watches, waiting, always. It was supposed to be a casual evening hike. My cousin and I had done this trail dozens of times before. It snaked through the hills above the town, offering stunning views of the sunset and just enough challenge to make you feel accomplished. That evening, we set out later than usual, hoping to catch the stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. We didn't think twice when we passed the old sign at the trailhead. It was rusted and illegible, but we knew the path by heart. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the distant chirping of crickets. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows over the trail, making everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. About halfway up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. The sun was a fiery orange, sinking slowly into the horizon. But as the last rays of light faded, we noticed something strange. There was no moon, not even a sliver. The sky was darker than we had ever seen it, like a heavy curtain had been pulled across the stars. The first uneasy feeling crept in then, but neither of us said anything. We turned on our flashlights and kept walking. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us stop. We scanned the area with our flashlights. The beam landed on nothing but branches and leaves. My cousin shrugged it off, muttering something about deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling continued, faint and deliberate, always staying just ahead of us on the trail. We kept walking, faster now, the rhythm of our footsteps breaking the silence. The trail felt different somehow, narrower. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The rustling stopped. We froze, listening. The night had gone completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. My flashlight flickered and my stomach dropped. I smacked it against my palm and the light steadied, but that moment of darkness was enough to make my heart race. Then we heard it, a voice, low and breathy, coming from the trees. Help. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My cousin and I looked at each other, eyes wide. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. Help me. It didn't sound right. The tone was off, hollow, and strained, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was shrouded in shadow, its shape impossible to define. My cousin aimed his flashlight at it, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. It was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it moved like a living thing, jerking slightly as if adjusting to the light. We stood frozen, too scared to run, too scared to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing down the trail. Its arm was too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathe. Then it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The moment it was gone, the forest came alive again. The crickets chirped, the wind rustled the leaves, and it was as if nothing had happened. Without a word, my cousin and I turned and bolted back down the trail, running, as fast as our legs could carry us. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the car, we slammed the doors shut and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until we were back in town. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that voice. It wasn't asking for help. It was calling us in. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town, nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello." My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible. Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. "Those who seek will find, but they may not return." The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled "The Forgotten Path." My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Return. What is lost?" Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, the bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? It was a late afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore the old lighthouse by the coast. We had always known about it, a crumbling structure perched on the edge of the cliffs, long since abandoned. No one had used it in years, and the stories about its eerie past were the kind that had always fascinated us. The locals whispered of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but we weren't ones to believe in ghosts or urban legends. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky coastline as we made our way down the worn trail. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its once white walls now faded and streaked with age. The air was thick with salt, and the distant crash of waves echoed around us. Inside the lighthouse, the light was dim, flickering as though it hadn't been used in decades. We made our way up the narrow, creaking staircase, each step accompanied by a low groan of old wood. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out endlessly before us, the horizon blending into the sky. As we explored, the atmosphere grew heavier. The deeper we went into the lighthouse, the quieter it became. It was as if the building itself had swallowed the sounds of the outside world. We tried to brush off the creeping unease that settled over us. After all, old buildings had their quirks, right? That's when we found the door. It was at the back of the top floor, tucked into the corner of what should have been an empty room. The door wasn't locked, but it felt wrong to even touch it. It stood slightly ajar, as though someone had just stepped through and never returned. We hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about the air felt thick, oppressive. Still, curiosity won out. I stepped forward and pushed the door open, the sound of rusted hinges echoing in the silence. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed faintly. It led down into the bowels of the lighthouse, toward the basement. Without saying a word, we started down the hall, the distant rumble of the ocean growing louder as we descended. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, and the floor uneven, scattered with debris. At the bottom of the staircase was another door, this one sealed with rusted metal hinges. There was no light, no indication of what lay beyond. One of my friends reached out, slowly turning the knob. It screeched open, and we were hit with a blast of stale, musty air. The room beyond was in complete darkness. We fumbled for our flashlights illuminating the space before us. The room was vast and cavernous, filled with old, broken furniture and scattered bits of debris. But it wasn't what was in the room that made us freeze. It was what wasn't there. The floor was covered in footprints, small, barefoot prints that seemed to have formed in the dust, leading toward the center of the room. Some were fresh, as if they had been made recently. We followed the trail cautiously, the soft beams of our flashlights shaking in our hands. The prints led us to a pile of old crates in the corner. Beneath them, another door stood ajar, this one almost hidden by the debris. Without thinking, one of us pushed it open. The room beyond was even darker. Our flashlights barely penetrated the blackness, but I could see shapes, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught as the feeling of being watched became too overwhelming to ignore. Then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, we heard it, a soft whisper. It was distant at first, like the echo of a voice from a dream. But as we stood there, frozen, the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Let us out." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let us out. Let us out." The fear in my chest was unbearable, but we had to get out. We backed away from the door, our flashlights now shaking uncontrollably. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the entire room, surrounding us from every direction. And then, silence. We stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. The whispers were gone. Slowly, we made our way back up the stairs, hearts pounding in our ears. The feeling of being watched lingered long after we left the lighthouse behind, as though whatever was down there wasn't finished with us. To this day, I can't forget the sound of those whispers. The ones that promised we hadn't seen the last of them. It started as a simple trip to the old lighthouse, a place my family had visited countless times. We used to come here to watch the sunset, the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, the lighthouse casting its beam out over the water. This time, we decided to stay overnight, hoping for a quiet escape from the routine of life. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary at the edge of the rocky cliffs, its paint peeling and windows grimy from years of neglect. It wasn't operational anymore, but the view from the top was still breathtaking. Vast stretches of sea, endless skies, and the horizon meeting the horizon, uninterrupted. We set up our small tent a little ways down from the lighthouse, out of view from the old structure, and settled in for the evening. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the air became colder, the saltwater breeze sharp against my face. The sounds of the ocean became louder, more rhythmic, as if the waves themselves were trying to communicate. That's when things started to feel off. The usual quiet of the night was disrupted by strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the whispers weren't constant. They came and went, drifting in and out like ghostly echoes. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. My family was asleep in the tent, oblivious. Then I noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse, standing dark and foreboding, had always felt like a landmark, a safe beacon of light in the darkness. But now it felt different. It wasn't just that it was no longer operational. It felt like it had a presence of its own. I felt watched. I decided to climb up to the lighthouse, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The inside of the structure was cold and damp, the smell of aged wood and salt overwhelming. Dust particles danced in the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. I took the stairs to the top, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. At the top of the lighthouse, I stood in awe of the view. But as I looked out across the horizon, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, far below. It was too far for me to make out any details, but it stood motionless, like a statue. I squinted, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move. My heart pounded. I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried my voice away. I wanted to go back down, but something held me there. The figure remained, staring, unmoving. I turned to leave when I heard a sound, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind me. My blood ran cold. I was alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I spun around, expecting to see nothing, but there it was. A figure at the top of the stairs, eerily still, its face obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the figure following, its presence closer now, as if it were breathing down my neck. When I reached the bottom, I bolted toward the tent, heart racing, the whispers now louder, more insistent. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, when my family woke, there was no sign of the figure, just the sound of the ocean and the wind. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had watched me from the cliff was still out there, waiting. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted backroads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. I was on a road trip, solo, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road stretching ahead. I decided to take a scenic route, away from the highways, weaving through small, forgotten towns. The goal was simple: get lost in the quiet and enjoy the freedom of being alone. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The winding road was flanked by endless fields of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing around, just miles of isolation and silence. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the car, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. As the light faded, I found myself searching for a place to stop for the night. There was no sign of a town or motel for miles, just endless fields and a single, overgrown dirt path leading off to the side of the road. It wasn't much of a choice, but I decided to follow the path, hoping to find a clearing to park and rest. The path led me to a small, abandoned barn surrounded by broken-down fences. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, with weeds growing thick through the cracks in the wood. I parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched was too distinct. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. I decided to explore the barn, curious about what might be inside. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dark interior. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. What was once used to store hay and farm tools had become a hollow shell of rotting wood and forgotten belongings. I moved further into the barn, shining my flashlight around the dusty space. Old furniture covered in layers of grime, rusted tools scattered on the floor. There was nothing of interest, just reminders of what the place once was. I felt my unease growing, but my curiosity kept me going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light. My breath hitched as I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the shadows, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there it was. A human-shaped silhouette standing still as if trapped in the dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took another step, and then another, my legs feeling heavy. With each movement, the figure seemed to draw closer, though it didn't advance itself. It was like we were inching toward each other slowly, relentlessly. When I was just a few feet away, I saw it. The face, or what I thought was a face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, void of any life or expression. The features were distorted, almost alien. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The barn creaked again, and then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled backward, tripping over some debris and falling to the ground. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, trying to escape, but the figure moved faster than I could comprehend. I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were on fire as I burst through the barn door, gasping for air. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figure far behind, lost in the darkness. I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. But I do know this: I'll never take another solo road trip into the unknown. I don't remember exactly when I noticed something strange. It wasn't a specific moment, more like a slow, creeping feeling that followed me for days. I was spending a week at my family's lake house, a place we've always gone to relax. Nothing special, just a quiet cabin on the edge of a still lake surrounded by forest. The first few days were peaceful, just me and my parents. We spent our time fishing, hiking, and reading. The lake was calm and the forest stretched endlessly around us. I figured it was just one of those perfect summer trips where nothing goes wrong. But then the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, my heart pounding. The dreams weren't anything like the usual ones. No monsters, no shadows lurking in the dark. It was more like silence. A deep, oppressive silence that felt too heavy to breathe in. The forest, the lake. It was all too quiet. I could hear my own breathing and nothing else. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no waves lapping at the shore. Just a complete void of sound. The third night, it happened again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the quiet surroundings messing with my head. I got out of bed and stepped onto the small porch, hoping a breath of fresh air would clear my mind. But as soon as I stepped outside, I felt it. Something wasn't right. The lake, usually serene and reflective, had become unsettlingly still. I sat down on the porch, staring at the water, listening to the echo of my thoughts. Then I noticed something. The surface of the lake wasn't calm anymore. It had started to ripple. Not from any wind, but from something beneath it. At first, I thought maybe it was just a fish or some animal moving through the water, but the ripples weren't natural. They formed a pattern, slow and deliberate. A figure, faint and shadowy, began to emerge beneath the surface. I froze. The figure didn't resemble a person. It was long, distorted, its limbs unnaturally elongated, moving like it was struggling to pull itself from the depths. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, were hollow and dark, like the void beneath the water. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure seemed to glide toward me, its movements unnatural, like something from a dream, too wrong to be real. I could feel its gaze, even though it had no visible face. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't something human. Then it vanished. The water grew calm again. I blinked, not sure if what I had seen was real. The air felt heavy, and I sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. Eventually, I forced myself back inside, locking every door and window. The next morning, my parents woke me up as if nothing had happened. The sun was shining, and everything seemed normal. We went about our day, fishing, laughing, trying to forget about the quiet nights. But I knew deep down that something had changed. It's been years since that trip, but I still visit the lake house. The dreams haven't stopped, and sometimes in the stillness of the night, I wonder if I'll see that figure again, waiting beneath the surface, watching. It was a summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood park. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown trails. I had lived in this town my entire life, but I had always avoided this park, partly because it had a reputation, mostly forgotten now, of being haunted or unsettling. People used to talk about strange noises, whispers, and figures moving through the trees, but I never paid much attention to those stories. That night, though, I needed some quiet, some space to clear my head. The park wasn't far from my home, just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the old oaks loomed over the trails and the air smelled thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I strolled down the main path, the woods on either side seemed darker than I remembered, the trees taller and more imposing. The usual sounds of the city were distant now, just the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of insects. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. I had a strange feeling, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. I passed by an old wooden bench, splintered and half-rotted, its paint chipped and faded. It had been there forever, the kind of thing no one really paid attention to anymore. But something about it caught my eye. A faint scratch, almost too faint to notice, ran down the bench's surface. The marks looked as if they'd been made by long, sharp claws. I paused for a moment, staring at the bench, my heart thudding harder. It couldn't have been anything natural. No animal could have left such clean, precise scratches. Maybe kids had vandalized it, but the deeper I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as though those marks weren't meant to be there at all. I shook off the unease and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I ventured further into the park, I noticed something strange. The trees weren't swaying with the breeze like they should have been. Instead, the branches hung motionless, as if the wind itself had vanished. Then came the sound. A low, raspy whisper carried by the stillness. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, as though it had traveled from far away. I stopped, listening, but the whisper faded before I could make out any words. My stomach twisted into knots, and I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, as though I could outrun whatever had made that sound. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a figure partially obscured by the thick trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't look human. Its outline was too tall, too lanky, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Shadows seemed to crawl along its body, swallowing it whole. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something stir inside me. A primal fear I couldn't explain. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift or move. It simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. But as I passed, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I clenched my fists, willing my legs to carry me faster. A rustling behind me snapped my attention back. I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there it was again. The whisper, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, just fragments, like someone muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed to bend toward me now, their branches brushing the path like fingers reaching out. The unease grew until it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course, there was nothing but static in this part of the park, and I had no way to call for help even if I wanted to. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, this time closer, closer than I'd ever imagined. It was right behind me now, following, breathing down my neck. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the woods, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Who's there? I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer, just the whisper. Louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The whisper, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. All of it disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking, every step trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn something was still there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. The park finally gave way to the street, and as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. I've never gone back to the park. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it. The voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. Come outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own. I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friends' rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." I still remember that trip to the old library. It wasn't like the modern ones with glass walls and computer stations. This library had a heavy, musty smell, old wooden shelves creaking beneath countless books, the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while wandering through a quiet, forgotten town. The library sat at the edge of a narrow, winding street. We were drawn to it, not by any plan, but by sheer curiosity. It looked abandoned, its windows cracked, paint peeling from the facade. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the wind, its faded letters barely readable. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the world. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light. I remember feeling a strange stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. There was no one there, just the four of us. We wandered through the aisles, running our fingers along the spines of the old books, their titles long forgotten. The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The silence seemed to throb, each creak of the wooden floorboards louder than it should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal resting on one of the shelves that things started to feel off. The journal was thick, its cover worn with age. I opened it, curious, and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, filled with strange symbols and passages that made no sense. Some entries were incomprehensible. Others spoke of things that shouldn't be known. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the scribbles, my hands trembling as I flipped further. But what truly unsettled me was a single line written on the very last page. It was as if someone had scrawled it in a panic, hurried and jagged. "They are watching. They have always been watching." I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Anything. But the library remained empty. The others were still exploring, oblivious to the unease that had taken hold of me. I hurried to put the journal back, but when I turned around, the air grew colder. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. just the same old shelves and the thick silence. My friends returned, laughing about some old book they'd found. I couldn't tell them about what I had seen. What if they thought I was imagining things? Or worse, what if they laughed it off like it was nothing? We stayed for a while longer, trying to enjoy the quiet atmosphere. But every so often, I felt those eyes again. Watching, always watching. The feeling stayed with me long after we left the library, and to this day, I wonder who or what was there, waiting for us. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one, just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over, but deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. It started on a warm summer evening. I decided to take a long walk through a park near my apartment. It wasn't particularly special, just one of those city parks with paved paths, trees, and a small pond that people like to visit on weekends. I wasn't expecting much, just some fresh air and a bit of peace. As I walked, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows from the trees. The place was mostly deserted, save for a few scattered families and couples enjoying the cool evening. I passed a group of kids playing near the pond, their laughter echoing off the water. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I welcomed the quiet. I hadn't wandered far when I noticed something strange. A bench further along the path was occupied by a figure sitting completely still. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe someone deep in thought, taking a moment to rest. But as I got closer, I saw that there was no movement, no indication that they were alive. I stopped a few paces away, studying them from a distance. The figure was slouched forward, their head bowed as if lost in thought. But something wasn't right. Their posture wasn't relaxed. It was unnatural. They sat there, motionless, not responding to the world around them. Even the gentle evening breeze seemed to avoid disturbing them. I stood there, unsure whether to approach. Something felt off, like they were not supposed to be there. Slowly, I took a step closer, my breath coming a little quicker. The closer I got, the more I realized that the figure wasn't breathing. I froze. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they were asleep, but how could they sit like that, so completely still? I glanced around, trying to gather my thoughts. There were no signs of life anywhere nearby. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for me. My instinct was to leave, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. A quiet voice in my head told me to stay, that I couldn't just walk away from this. I stepped closer, my breath shallow as I tried to make out any detail, anything that could tell me they were alive. That's when I saw it. The face, pale, void of any expression. It wasn't the stillness that terrified me most, but the eyes. They were open, but they didn't reflect light, didn't seem to see. There was no life behind them, only emptiness. I took another hesitant step forward, my heart pounding harder now. The figure didn't move. I reached out slowly, trembling fingers brushing against the arm. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like they had been there for ages. Terror surged through me, but before I could turn and run, a faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible above the silence. It was a voice, hollow and distant. "Don't leave." I spun around, but there was no one there. The park was still empty, the fading light of the sun casting long shadows. I looked back at the figure whose gaze seemed to follow me as I backed away. With every step, I felt as though something was pulling at me, drawing me closer again. I forced myself to turn and run, my legs carrying me away from the figure, from the park, from whatever had been watching me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the park was silent again. No sign of the figure, no echo of the voice, only the fading hum of the city in the distance. I didn't go back to that park, and to this day I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to leave. I didn't believe in anything strange, spirits, haunted places, or anything that couldn't be explained by science. That is, until the night we went camping deep in the forest. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend away from everything, but what we encountered still haunts me. We found a spot off the beaten trail, miles from the nearest campground. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. It felt peaceful, remote, and untouched by the outside world. We set up camp beneath towering pines, built a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It wasn't until we fell silent that I realized something was off. The usual sounds of the woods, the rustling leaves, the gentle hum of the breeze, had stopped. Completely. The night felt unnervingly still. Even my friends, usually loud and talkative, grew quiet, as though we were all waiting for something we couldn't name. Around midnight, the wind returned, but it was no longer gentle. It howled through the trees with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. The fire flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the forest floor. I shifted uneasily in my seat, glancing around. The shadows seemed to twist and move in ways they shouldn't. That's when we heard it, the sound of someone walking through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps that didn't match the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't the crunch of leaves or the soft padding of paws. It was something heavier, more human, but not quite right. "Did you hear that?" one of my friends whispered. We all nodded, our nerves taut. I felt the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. "Maybe it's an animal," I offered weakly, though none of us truly believed it. The footsteps grew louder, circling our camp. They came from all directions, and it didn't take long to realize whoever, or whatever, was moving wasn't trying to hide. They wanted us to hear. I stood up, heart racing. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to move. My friends followed my gaze as we watched shadows creep closer through the underbrush. Then it happened. From the trees, something emerged. Something that wasn't human, but not quite a creature either. It was tall, far too tall for any person, with limbs that bent unnaturally and skin that seemed to ripple like water. Its face was smooth, almost featureless, except for two black, hollow eyes that gleamed in the firelight. "Run," someone whispered, and we all turned to flee. But the figure didn't move like we did. It glided silently through the trees, faster than we could ever hope to outrun it. We could hear it, feel its presence as though it was right behind us, always just a step away. We made it back to the car, slammed the doors shut, locked them, and peeled away from the woods as fast as we could. None of us spoke. We couldn't. The image of that thing, its endless eyes watching us from the shadows, was burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I can still feel its gaze. I don't know what it was, or why it followed us. All I know is that sometimes, some places leave scars deeper than memory. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical. It was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something, anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again. The woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there. She was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. but the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that, and I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple: take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange, a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there, staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back, but I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since. I've always loved the city at night. The neon lights, the quiet hum of cars far off in the distance. There's something peaceful about it. I never thought much of urban legends or ghost stories. They always felt too far-fetched for someone like me, someone who preferred logic and reason. But one night, everything changed. It was a routine evening walk through the city, something I'd done countless times before. I left my apartment, heading toward the park that bordered the edge of downtown. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional footsteps echoing beneath the towering skyscrapers. I didn't mind the quiet. It felt peaceful, a rare escape from the buzz of the day. As I walked, I passed by a small, dimly lit convenience store, its fluorescent lights flickering like a heartbeat. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trash to skitter across the pavement. The park was just a block away, so I decided to cut through and take the shortcut. The park was eerily quiet, even for the middle of the night. The usual sounds of the city seemed to vanish. No distant traffic, no voices from the few people that might wander through. It was as though the park had been consumed by some invisible void. I took another step and realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but I could feel it. Something was watching me. The sensation prickled at the back of my neck and my pulse quickened. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there, just the shadows of trees looming over the pathway. Probably just my nerves, I muttered to myself. I took a deep breath and started walking again, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The quiet became oppressive, the kind that weighs down your chest and makes you question if you're really alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, of something trailing behind me in the dark. Every step I took felt heavier, more deliberate, as though something, or someone, was watching from the shadows, waiting. I reached a clearing near the center of the park where an old, rusted bench sat under a single street lamp that flickered intermittently. I hesitated, looking around, but still saw no sign of anyone. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, blending into the darkness, watching. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, carried by the wind. Not words, just a low, indistinct murmur, as if the air itself was speaking. My heart pounded harder. I instinctively stepped back, my breath quick and shallow. I wasn't alone. Something moved in the shadows, shifting just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. I froze, eyes wide, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing, just darkness and the faint sound of rustling leaves. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I started walking faster now, trying to shake the overwhelming feeling of dread. But the whisper followed me, growing louder, more persistent. My mind raced, wondering if I'd somehow stumbled into some bizarre dream or hallucination. I kept expecting to turn a corner and see someone, or something, standing there, watching me from the darkness. But nothing came. As I neared the edge of the park, I felt something brush against my leg. I jerked back, heart pounding. There was nothing there. The whisper had grown into a chorus of faint voices, overlapping and unintelligible, as though a crowd of whispers was surrounding me, closing in. Panic set in. I broke into a sprint, sprinting as fast as I could out of the park, back toward the street where my apartment was. My breath came in short, ragged gasps and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. When I reached the edge of the park, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my apartment, doors bolted, lights on. The next morning, I told myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination, maybe caused by stress or exhaustion. But I can't forget the feeling of being followed, of those whispers in the dark, of something just beyond my sight. To this day, I still wonder if I was truly alone that night, or if something not human, was watching me, waiting. It started as an ordinary day at home. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. Nothing special ever happened, and I liked it that way. But one evening, everything changed. The air was crisp, and I decided to open my window to let in some fresh air. The sounds of the city drifted up, cars honking, distant voices, the hum of traffic. But that evening, it felt different. The usual background noise was quieter, as if the city had fallen into some strange kind of hush. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe everyone else was just quieter tonight. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, flipping through a book. But my focus was slipping. I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, so I glanced toward the window. The street below was eerily quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was like the world had suddenly gone still. I decided to step onto my balcony, which overlooked the narrow alley between my building and the next. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I swear, the alley had never looked this dark before. The street lamps that usually lit the way barely cast any glow tonight. Everything was in shadows. That's when I noticed it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but the figure that emerged from the darkness didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in ways that defied logic. It glided more than walked, its movements fluid but disjointed. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved. So wrong, so unnatural, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure seemed to float closer to my building, heading toward the alley where I stood. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I was too scared to look back outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the door, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The next day, I didn't see anything unusual, but the fear lingered. I went about my routine, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the lights on in every room, my eyes darting between the windows and the dark spaces beyond. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath hitching. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was counting each tap. I grabbed my phone and backed away, heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, just that relentless knocking. I stood there, unable to move, listening to the sound echo through my apartment. Then came a louder knock, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, "Let me in." I bolted the door and hid under my bed. I didn't come out until morning, my mind in a fog of fear and disbelief. To this day, I never found an explanation for what I saw or heard. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something human. It was a quiet summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and soak in the stillness of the countryside. We left town with no real plan, winding down narrow back roads, passing the occasional farmhouse and letting the radio fill the silence. We ended up on an old, forgotten road, the kind with broken pavement and weeds pushing through cracks. It stretched on for miles, empty except for the occasional crows circling above. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a dull orange glow. We pulled over at a random spot where the trees opened up, leaving a stretch of land that felt completely isolated. The silence was heavier now, the kind that creeps into your chest, making it harder to breathe. We got out of the car, stretched, and walked a few feet to sit on the hood, staring out at the horizon. It felt perfect, peaceful, distant, far from the chaos of everything. But as the minutes stretched on, a strange sense of tension began to creep in. My friend Jess was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of wind through the grass, but then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, echoing sound. A voice, perhaps, or something that barely resembled one. It was hard to tell. The sound came and went, almost like breathing, but slower, heavier. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some far-off noise we couldn't identify. But it didn't sit right. There was something too deliberate about it, like it was aware of us. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. We relaxed a bit, laughed nervously, and chalked it up to our imagination. But as soon as we settled back into our thoughts, we heard it again. This time, it was closer, more distinct. A whisper, drawn out, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. We all leaned in, listening harder now. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the clearing, just beyond where we could see. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us. "Let's get back to the car," I said, standing up. My voice was shaky. The fear I felt wasn't like any I'd ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual. But as we turned to walk back, we heard it again. Closer this time, and clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was laughter. A low, hollow laughter, chilling in its emptiness. It didn't sound like any human laugh. It wasn't playful. It was wrong. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Our feet moved faster, scrambling back toward the car, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees. When we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors shut and locked them. I could barely see through the windshield, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The laughter didn't stop. It was all around us now, growing louder, closer. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just as I was about to start the engine, Jess screamed. I turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes empty and hollow, watching us from the edge of the woods. We didn't hesitate. The car roared to life, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the empty road. The figure remained behind, standing motionless as we drove away. But I could still hear the laughter, trailing off into the distance. Even now, I wonder what was out there that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some animal, something we couldn't understand. But the look in its eyes, empty and hollow, tells me otherwise. Whatever was there, whatever followed us, is still out there. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip. It was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face. Only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I had always loved nature, the quiet peace of being out in the open, surrounded by trees and distant mountains. One summer, my friends and I decided to spend the weekend hiking deep into a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no electricity, just us, the trail, and the wilderness. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and escape the noise of the world. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees with sunlight filtering through the canopy. We made good time, laughing and sharing stories, taking occasional breaks to catch our breath. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of the forest. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The sky was clear, the stars visible above us. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. We built a fire, cooked some food, and enjoyed the peace. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard it. A faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, listening. It wasn't coming from any of my friends. The voices were too distant, too faint, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, things had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. My friends noticed it too. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something we couldn't quite explain. While my friends were packing up, I wandered off to explore. The woods had always been my escape, but today something felt different. I followed a narrow path deeper into the trees, drawn by a sense of curiosity and unease. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, almost like they were watching. That's when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still among the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to make out at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in. I turned to run, but my legs felt frozen, heavy. I couldn't look away. The figure remained unmoving, its presence so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one. The woods were silent again. I didn't wait to find out what was following me. I ran back to camp, heart racing. My friends were there, gathering our things. I didn't want to scare them, so I kept what I had seen to myself. We left the clearing and continued down the trail, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, as we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light, my mind playing tricks, or something else entirely. But the figure, the feeling of being watched, those are memories that will stay with me forever. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed. A break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold. A trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp, toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows. It was an early spring day, and I was driving alone on a remote country road. The landscape stretched out around me, fields of tall, golden grass swaying gently in the breeze. The road twisted and turned through empty stretches of land, the occasional farmhouse appearing in the distance before disappearing again. I wasn't in any rush. It had been a long week, and I figured a quiet drive was just what I needed to clear my head. My car's engine hummed softly, and the only sounds were the tires on the road and the occasional chirping of birds. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, another farmhouse far off in the distance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a farmhouse at all. It was an old, wooden structure, half buried in weeds and overgrown trees. The roof was caved in, windows shattered, and the whole thing seemed to lean at a strange angle, like it had been there for decades, forgotten by time. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. The building didn't look like it had been lived in for a long, long time, but there was something unsettling about its quiet, abandoned state. I figured it must have been some sort of barn at one point, but now it was just a hollow shell of what it used to be. I parked the car a few hundred feet away and stepped out, the dry earth crunching underfoot. The wind stirred the trees, making them creak softly. I approached the old structure cautiously, my footsteps slowing as I took in the eerie silence. When I got to the door, I pushed it open gently. Dust and cobwebs hung in the air, and the stench of decay was thick. It smelled like something had died in there and never been removed. My flashlight flickered to life, casting long shadows across the interior. Inside, the place was a mess. Rotting beams, broken furniture, and scattered debris. But what caught my attention was something on the far wall, something I hadn't noticed until I moved deeper into the barn. It was a photograph, nailed crookedly to the wood. The image was yellowed with age, almost too faded to make out, but I could tell it depicted a family, 2 parents and 3 children, standing in front of the barn with smiles frozen on their faces. My stomach twisted. I hadn't expected to find anything like this. The faces in the photograph looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. I glanced around the room, running my flashlight beam over the clutter. That's when I noticed more photos, dozens of them. Old family portraits, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, all of them nailed to the walls. The people in the photos seemed to watch me, their smiles distorted, eyes fixed on something just beyond the frame. The air grew colder, and I felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. I stumbled back, my hand shaking as I tore my eyes away from the photographs. My light flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, soft, almost inaudible, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time, like a breath in my ear. My heart pounded as I slowly turned back to the photos. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. The people in the photographs weren't just staring at me. They were moving. Ever so slightly, their faces contorted, their expressions shifting from smiles to something darker. The eyes that had once looked joyful now seemed hollow, empty, as if they were gazing at something beyond the frame. The shadows in the room deepened, and I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were moving, like they were stepping out from the photographs. Panic surged through me as I bolted for the door. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, flickering shadows across the doorway. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from all sides, their faint murmurs growing into distorted echoes. I didn't look back. I sprinted to my car, heart racing, and slammed the door shut behind me. As I sped away down the empty road, I could still feel those hollow eyes staring at me from inside the barn. I don't know who or what they were, or why they were trapped in those photos, but I'm sure of one thing. They're still there, waiting. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yards standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me. and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. It was the last day of my trip to the mountains. I had spent the past week hiking, exploring remote trails, and basking in the beauty of nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least during the day. On my final evening, I decided to take one last walk down to a secluded pond deep in the forest. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, inky black. The trees stretched high above, casting long shadows that made it feel like the world was shrinking around me. The walk to the pond wasn't long, but it was quiet. Too quiet. I could feel the isolation, the stillness pressing against my chest. It felt as though the world had been hushed just for me. I reached the pond, which glimmered under the dim light of the stars reflecting off the water. I sat down on a rock, letting out a long breath. As I stared into the still pond, something shifted in the water's surface. A ripple formed, spreading outward in slow waves. I leaned in closer, my reflection breaking apart with each wave. But then something else appeared, something underneath the surface. At first, it looked like just another reflection, distorted by the ripples. But then I saw it. Two pale, lifeless eyes staring back at me from the depths. I stumbled back from the water, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched those eyes slowly rise from the depths. The figure emerged slowly, its movements awkward, unnatural. It was pale, its skin wrinkled and damp like it had been submerged for years. But it wasn't just a reflection, it was real. The figure didn't step fully out of the water. It hovered just above the surface, those hollow eyes still locked onto mine. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the loose dirt. The figure didn't move, didn't chase me, but its gaze never wavered. I ran, heart racing, lungs burning with every step. The forest around me seemed alive, the trees stretching their branches toward the ground like clawed hands. I didn't stop until I was back at my campsite, my chest heaving. The echo of those hollow eyes burned into my mind. The next morning, I returned to the pond one last time, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the empty forest. Whatever I saw, whatever that thing was gone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, hidden somewhere deep in the shadows of the woods. I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old, faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sound seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive. The kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still, too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved, just a twitch of its head, too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. I'll never forget the night it happened. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect anything strange, just an ordinary apartment complex on the outskirts of town. My roommate, Anna, and I had lived there for about a year, always keeping to ourselves, never believing in anything supernatural. That night, I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone while Anna had already gone to bed. The building was quiet, except for the faint sound of creaking floors as people moved around in neighboring apartments. I didn't think much of it until I heard something coming from inside my closet. At first, I assumed it was just the usual settling of the building, old pipes, settling walls, creaking floorboards. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting inside the closet, dragging something along the floor. I set my phone down and sat up, listening. The sound was coming from the back of the closet, from deep within. My pulse quickened as I imagined what could be inside. I stood up, my feet making soft thuds on the worn carpet, and walked toward the closet. The door creaked open as I pulled it back. I didn't know what I expected, but it wasn't what I saw. Nothing but old clothes and random boxes stacked in the corner. I sighed, relieved but still uneasy, and pulled the closet door shut again. As I turned to head back to bed, something caught my eye. A faint shadow flickering at the edge of the doorframe. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But the shadow lingered, unmoving. I wanted to dismiss it, but something wasn't right. Slowly, I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. I reached out and touched the doorframe, but there was nothing there. Then, from inside the apartment came a whisper. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was in my head. "Let me out." I spun around, my breath catching. The whisper had come from the direction of the closet, but there was no one there. My hands trembled as I forced myself to look back at the closet door. It was still shut, but I could feel the presence of whatever, or whoever, was on the other side. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Let me out." I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My legs moved involuntarily toward the closet. I wasn't in control anymore, as if something had taken over my body. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to process what I was hearing. Then, with a burst of courage I didn't know I had, I threw open the closet door. Nothing, just empty clothes and old boxes. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared into the abyss of the dark closet. But it wasn't empty. I could feel it, like someone, or something, was watching me from within. I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, unable to take my eyes off the closet. The whisper was still there, though it had softened like it was retreating but not quite gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every shuffle of a neighbor in the hall, felt like it was pointing right to me. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look inside the closet again. I told Anna what happened, but she didn't believe me. Still, that night, and every night after, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whisper, "Let me out." It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home along the old highway, a stretch of road I'd traveled countless times before. The highway was long, desolate, cutting through empty fields that stretched on for miles. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just me and the endless blackness. As I drove, I noticed something strange. About halfway home, I passed a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was someone stranded, maybe they lived nearby. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I realized they were still there, walking in the same direction. I didn't see their face, only the silhouette of someone in a dark coat. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and they walked as though they didn't notice my car at all. My instinct told me to stop, to ask if they needed help, but something about their movements didn't sit right. They weren't stumbling or waving for help. They just kept walking, their figure blending into the darkness like they belonged there. I kept driving, the unease growing in my gut. I checked the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, now further back, just as distant and unchanging as before. By the time I reached the next bend, the figure was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, relieved. Maybe they'd turned off the road, or found whatever they were looking for. But as I approached the next stretch of road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing there, just a few feet from where I had last seen them. This time, they were facing the road. Their head was tilted, watching me as I drove closer. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. There was something about the way they moved, so slow, so deliberate, that sent a chill through me. I could feel their gaze locked onto my car. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself they were just lost, maybe trying to get to a destination. But that thought didn't comfort me. There was something deeply unnatural about how still they stood, how they didn't react to the passing cars or the distant sound of my horn. As I approached, I noticed the figure wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, off into the horizon as though something far beyond the road had their attention. I hesitated. watching in horror as they began to move again, this time walking toward the trees at the edge of the field. I didn't stop to watch. I sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was that? Why were they walking down the highway like that, so out of place? When I finally made it home, the house felt too quiet. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe they were a hitchhiker who wandered off into the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The figure wasn't normal. They had felt off, wrong, in ways I couldn't explain. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see them again, standing in the darkness, watching. I've never driven that stretch of road again. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other. My friends and I decided to take a late-night trip to the old observatory on the outskirts of town. It wasn't something we normally did, but curiosity got the better of us. The observatory was an eerie place, abandoned for years, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. When we arrived, everything felt different from the start. The building had a sense of stillness that wasn't natural. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods, it was more oppressive, more unnatural. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. We approached the gate that led to the entrance, its iron bars creaking as we pushed through. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in on one side. The place looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades. We ventured inside, flashlights flickering as we made our way through the dust-covered rooms. The once magnificent observatory was now a hollow shell, debris strewn across the floor and old telescopes covered in cobwebs. The silence felt deafening, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like the forest had swallowed everything whole. As we made our way deeper, I noticed something strange. There was no sound at all, not even from the forest beyond. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had stopped. We found our way to the control room, the only part of the building that still had some semblance of structure. The faded, old star maps hung from the walls, their bright colors now faded and cracked. It was eerie, standing in a place that was once alive with science, now abandoned and lifeless. That's when we noticed something wasn't right. The flicker of our flashlights cast distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. I turned to ask my friend what he thought, but when I spoke, my voice barely came out. It was as if the very air had swallowed it. Something felt off. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was gone. We kept exploring, trying to shake the feeling of unease. My friend checked the broken telescope, pointing the lens toward the sky. "It's jammed," he said, fumbling with the controls. Then he gasped. The sky through the lens wasn't what it should have been. The stars, usually so distant and infinite, were distorted, twisted, flickering as if they weren't really there. A strange hum began to fill the room, subtle at first, but growing louder. "What's happening?" my friend whispered. I didn't know what to say. The hum grew into a low, almost mechanical vibration, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on us harder. It was like the world was bending, as though we were seeing something we weren't supposed to. That's when I noticed it again. That figure, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, was back, standing just at the edge of the room. This time, its face was visible. It wasn't human. Its eyes weren't empty, but filled with something ancient, something malevolent. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it had always been there. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my ears popping, the vibrations reverberating through my chest. I turned to my friends, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was closer now, standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. And then, just as quickly as everything had started, the hum stopped. The world went silent again. I blinked, shaking, and found myself back in the control room. My friends were there, looking at me, their faces pale. They were talking, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't hear a word. It was as if the silence had returned with a vengeance. We left the observatory in silence, no one speaking of what we had seen. I glanced back at the building one last time, the distant trees now swaying, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the woods. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the hum, and the silence. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I had always loved taking long drives. There was something peaceful about winding roads and open landscapes, a way to clear my head and escape from the chaos of everyday life. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful week, I decided to take a spontaneous trip out into the countryside. The sun was setting as I pulled onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by forests on either side. The world felt silent, distant, almost untouched by time. I had no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, stretching long and menacing across the pavement. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching. I had the strange feeling that I was being pulled further into some unseen force. I passed a few old, crumbling signs for landmarks that no longer existed. The further I went, the less familiar everything became. The road twisted and turned, the forest thickening around me, swallowing any sense of direction or familiarity. That's when I saw her. At least, I think it was her. A figure standing motionless by the side of the road. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as she stared straight ahead, not moving. I slowed down as I approached, unable to look away. My heart pounded as I passed by her, but something felt off. I glanced back in my rear-view mirror. She wasn't there anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, empty and desolate. I shook my head, trying to brush off the lingering feeling of unease. Maybe I was imagining things, but something about that figure felt wrong. As I continued driving, I came to a sudden realization. I had no idea where I was. The road had changed. It wasn't just winding anymore. It felt like I was on a loop, repeating the same stretch of forest over and over. My panic grew as I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to break free from this endless cycle of trees. Then I noticed something strange. Lights. Not from my car, but from deep within the forest. Flickering, distant, like someone was trying to signal to me. I couldn't stop myself. I followed the faint glow deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see a figure moving towards me. It wasn't the woman from before. This figure was taller, obscured by the thick shadows, but its eyes seemed to shine like dark pools. The closer I got, the harder it was to focus. The light was almost blinding now, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure stepped into view, and I realized whatever this was wasn't human. Its face was distorted, twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. No features, no expression, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic took over, but my body refused to move. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and drive back, but my gaze was locked on the creature. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. The light faded, leaving me in the same endless darkness. I knew I couldn't stay. I spun my car around, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, barely noticing the trees passing by, the landscape a blur of black and gray. Hours later, I found myself back on a familiar highway, far from the forest. My hands still trembled, and the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I never will. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person. At least, not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker. someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places I've learned are better left untouched,